With any business, there's hurdles and you stub your toe a lot along the way, but that's business. No one's ever run it perfect.
I'm super excited to be here with Nathan Bullock, owner at Deserving Vacations. You have been doing this for 15 years, right? A long time. If you could talk to Nathan that was first getting started, what would be a word of advice?
Change is going to be inevitable, and you're going to have to grow within the confines of this industry. You think you have it all figured out. Change lends itself to opportunity, because if your company's going through it, then everyone else is.
Change is inevitable.
It doesn't always have to be tech related or growing in that way. It's, do you need to get back to the basics? Do we need to take a step back and really lean into what got us there? Change just really is opportunity for any company.
What do you think are the elements of that foundation that you want to make sure you have in place before you start focusing on growth?
It's problematic for a company that's in the hospitality property management space to
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hospitality Edge podcast, where we bring together what we think are two sides of the same coin, real estate and hospitality, and where we bring together entrepreneurs, investors, founders, operators, and leaders in the vacation rental and hospitality space so they can tell us about their stories, their journeys, the lessons they have learned, and maybe even some of the mistakes that they might have made along the way, so we don't have to make those same mistakes ourselves. Today, I'm super excited to be here with Nathan Bullock, owner at Deserving Vacations. Thank you so much, Nathan, for taking the time to be here today. Where are you taking the call from?
Thank you. I am on property at one of our places here on Isle Palm, South Carolina.
Amazing, Nathan. Amazing. So before we get started with your story and the lessons you've learned along the way, let's start with, if you had to start all over again in this business, in this industry, what would you do differently, if anything, or perhaps what's a mistake that you would aim to, avoid or treat in another way?
Sure. And, not as a cop-out answer, but I'm not sure, you really can do anything differently or would. The way it happens is the way it happens. And the happenstance for me was being a product of the hospitality industry here and stumbling upon what at the time was a website called Vacation Rentals by Owner. And I remember there was a certain owner within our portfolio here at the resort that used it. And back then it looked like, a version of Craigslist. But her house seemed to double up the income of everyone else. And so at that time, this is probably 2006, 2007. Airbnb didn't exist yet. It was really the first foray into getting distribution for somebody to go and maybe start, their journey outside the realm of somebody that had, a website in a corporation that got heavy traffic. It was the first way for somebody like myself to really get seen on a, domestic and global basis. So I'm not sure I would change anything really, differently. I think with any business, there's, hurdles and, you stub your toe a lot along the way, but that's business. No one's ever run it perfect. So it's just constantly.
Instead of something maybe that you would change, let's look at it differently, perhaps. Let's look at it as, what's something you wish you had known before that you know today? Or, if you could talk to yourself, if you could talk to the Nathan that was first getting started in this business, what would be like a heads up or a word of advice or a word of caution based on what you know today, which is, I'm sure, way more than you knew when you first got started in this space?
That, change is going to be inevitable, and you're going to have to grow within the confines of this industry in whatever form that takes. You think you have it all figured out. Like I said, whether that's like a OTA, like a Vrbo or an Airbnb, and then they might make a slight shift, or there's a new player in town, or From a pricing standpoint, can you really just manually do rates anymore, or do you have to start looking into third party logistics? And I think that's true. I gave a talk the other night at the local college here, and it was, you know, call it 10 years, 15 years ago, you really had to staff up with human beings. And now there's so many avenues for an entrepreneur to use, whether that's Upwork or Fiverr, or, there's people all across the globe willing to work in kind of an outsourced sort of way where, you know, a decade plus ago, you had to have an internal staff of employees. And I think just, the challenges of always trying to stay ahead of what's possible is really, kind of the challenge of any entrepreneur and leader. And that's probably my biggest day to day. And then of course, making sure our clients and guests are happy.
Yeah, that makes sense. Change is inevitable. I love that. And to go deeper into that, how do you approach change currently in a way that is productive, helpful, in a way that at the end of the day allows you to capitalize on opportunities? What's your approach to that lesson that you've learned through the years of like, hey, change is going to happen, so therefore just kind of embrace it? How do you go about embracing it?
Well, I think you just said it. I think change lends itself to opportunity, because if your company's going through it, then everyone else in your space is also. And so who's going to rise up and really, make that pivot that might be necessary, or it might even be taking a step backwards and becoming more low tech or more hands on. It doesn't always have to be, tech related or growing in that way.
Mm-hmm.
It's do you need to get back to the basics? Have we gotten, a little above our pay grade, and do we need to take a step back and really lean into what got us there and stuff like that? So I think change just really is, it's the bastion of opportunity for any company.
I love it. I love it. Now, Nathan, you have been doing this for 15 years, right? Like a long time. You
Yeah,
currently
this
have
would be
60
entering year
properties,
16 where, yes.
right? Yeah, so it's taken you a lot of time to master your craft the way you do today. What can you tell us about the time it takes to generate the kind of results you've generated and the kind of growth you've been able to to have at the end of the day and to achieve? You and I were talking about the mindset of like getting rich slowly. Why do you think that that's important to you, and why do you think so many people are these days thinking that they can just like fast track through it all and just skip the learning curve?
Yeah, well, especially in this business, I mean, there's obviously going to be examples of somebody that found a niche idea or some sort of light bulb idea that just was gasoline on the fire, and seemingly overnight it grew into what it was. But especially in the hospitality business, which I think is your core audience or some of it, it is really instrumental that it's a yes business, it's a white glove business. And so, like anyone, we started with one property, and we had to make sure that every single guest was happy. We know how big reviews are in this industry. So success begets success. And so it was one became three, and three became five, and seven became 10. And, it's just one after the other being, blindly customer driven. And this is a yes business. And when you have the tools to say yes to guests, that's what we're going to do. And so I think that's led to our success. And it's a slow burn. It's a slow burn up. And then once you start getting to, I don't think there's like an exact amount of properties, but, clients talk to other clients, and neighbors talk to neighbors, and guests talk to guests. And, once you start getting it's like a domino effect. And once you start getting those level of properties, then you get more visibility, and with more visibility comes reputation, and then it kind of
Mhm.
tracks on its way upward. And then, like we were mentioning earlier, that presents its own set of issues. Scalability is and keeping your core competency and just I guess quality control are hurdles in that sense. So it's every step of the way providing, that white glove 5-star service. And look, and you're never going to please everyone 100%, but that's certainly the goal. And if you keep that focus, it'll lend itself to you really kind of doing the right thing at all turns, and generally that over a long enough period of time, when you look at it, is going to be up and to the right.
Hmm. And I think it's important to be conscious of the fact that it is okay for things to take time. It is okay for you know you to not see crazy growth year one, year two, year three necessarily, because you're building your foundations. And if you
Absolutely.
start growing on foundations that are not solid, then you know it can all crumble and fall afterwards.
Absolutely. And I think, you've seen, without naming names, I'm sure we can all think of companies that had a, meteoric rise and then a quick burnout as well. And that happens in all industries. And whether that's musicians or whatever it is, you can have this. I would rather have the slow, organic, incremental, sometimes albeit boring track up. There's a lot of companies in this country and elsewhere that you've never heard of. They just have this slow grind reputation. It's not flashy, but it's what gets the job, and it's what keeps people employed, and earns itself a good life for a lot of people.
Absolutely. Now, what do you think are the elements of that foundation that you want to make sure you have in place before you start focusing on growth a little bit more for you? If you could break it down, what do you think are those elements of that foundation?
I wouldn't say we define like core values or anything like that. You're not going to see that in an office where it has a bunch of catchphrases, but I think it's just that, hand to hand combat of human interaction with guests, with clients. When people call me, they're not, relegated to an 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. They have my cell phone at all times. Some clients like to text, some people like to call, some like to email. From a guest standpoint, no one's going to call a 1-800 number on our side. They're going to get a live human each time, because I think we all know that's probably the most frustrating experience when you might have an issue that needs resolving. Those are just maybe some analytics, but foundationally, it's just being blindly consumer focused, and that's really kind of our masthead. Is these people are spending a lot of money to go on vacation here, and it might be their one time with their family. It might be their only time they ever visit our beautiful area. So we need to make that happen. And we may never hear from them again, but anecdotally, we hear stories of, my son or daughter took their first steps in this vacation rental, or something of that ilk, and that's really special to be a part of. So just knowing that these are kind of a once, you might just get one at bat with each client, but if you continue to deliver, that grows from X amount of guests to, now we're doing 10,000 guests a year.
Now, Nathan, let me ask you this. You have mentioned, right, that it takes time, that you need to focus on those solid foundations, and that some people might see that from the outside and see that as the boring approach, right, but from the inside, you're just building the foundations and focusing on quality and focusing on sustainability, which leads to a better outcome long term. But how do you manage to keep yourself motivated? It's not like it's an easy business to be a part of. How have you managed to remain sort of motivated to continue making those incremental, improvements through time without getting discouraged by, one, the challenges of the business, and also the fact that, especially at first, it's not like things were just growing, like crazy, but rather progressively. It would be easy for people to give up, is basically what I'm saying, but you haven't after 15 years. What has allowed you to keep going?
I think it might just be part of, my characteristic traits. Um, I've always kind of been a competitor, and I like to see challenges, and I like to win, and things of that nature. Um, but like you said, it's not an easy business, but you can see that you do reap the rewards of what I was just saying anecdotally, whether that's a story that I just said. You get the nice messages after a stay. It makes you feel good. There's only so many non-digital formats anymore for humans to interact. And we're fortunate enough to be in kind of one of those industries where you are face to face. You do see people enjoying themselves, having a good time. They're outside, they're on the beach, they're not, sitting behind a computer. So we're in an environment that's, really stripped down to the core of, I think, human nature and what people really want to be doing. So we're providing that. And so it's, just like any business, it's rigorous, but there's worse things you could be doing. So providing the backdrop here, we're on a 1,600 acre, 7 mile island, on the Atlantic Ocean. It's a beautiful area. So it's hard to not be motivated by that sometimes. And, just with the business, you also think about what else would you want to be doing? And I think your audience knows, if you're a true entrepreneur, it's hard to work for other people. And that's just how I've kind of always been. And for the last 16 years, I've, been my own boss, if you will. And, some days that means you get a call at midnight, and that's a fire you got to put out. But for the most part, you're not kind of confined to typical life, which I think is refreshing as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. And talking about those challenges, would you have any stories that come to mind of something that you look back to and you're proud of having overcome, as far as a particular challenge goes, and with a challenge that is overcome always comes a lesson that is taken away from it. Anything that comes to mind?
I think, there's always been the micro, right? Somebody's locked out and you rush out to get them into the unit or whatever it is. But more macro based, I think when COVID hit, it shook everything up. And, it's weird to look back now that they closed the beach here. You could only rent for 30 days at a time. I still have the bank statement from April 2020, and it is just negative, 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 refunds of just mass cancellations, which is a massive hit to obviously any industry. And then, at the time, nobody knew how this was going to resolve itself, but the beach was closed. We could only rent for 30 days at a time, which in the short-term market is, not going to cut it long-term. But then, we kind of navigated that. And then, within X amount of months on the other side, especially in the vacation rental space, because that's kind of the only things that were really operating well at the time, it really kind of broke out, tenfold. But in that immediate circumstance, I was happy to see the way we kind of navigated that. And we were already ahead on a lot of touchless entry and things that, some people had not implemented yet out here. So we were ahead of the curve on stuff like that, which was refreshing when it all went down.
And what was your approach to managing the crisis of like the uncertainty, the cancellations, anything that you took out of that experience in terms of like, okay, you just said you like the way you handle things. What can we learn in terms of crisis management from you, the way you approach that period of your business?
Yeah, I think for me, sometimes the mundane of everything going the way it's supposed to be going can be its own, it can get boring. And not that anyone wishes a pandemic is going to strike, but when things like that happen, that's when you really find out kind of what you're made of. Do you thrive in crisis? What what's going to pay the bills? How are we going to do that? And then reminding yourself, for the most part, that in the immediacy, days feel like weeks, weeks feel like months. But when you kind of take the 30,000-foot view now of that time period, it's really a short kind of blip on the radar of a lifetime. It could be a year or several years that we look at it, but now we're 5 years removed from that. Um, but in that immediacy of, okay, if we can't rent, then what are we going to rent for? Just in the details, how are we going to do it? At the time, if somebody called me and wanted to rent one of our big homes for X amount of money, you take that money. That's not when you're
Mm-hmm.
really kind of haggling at the time. Anyone who's willing to kind of stay at that time, and for whatever, you were figuring out, price points and all that was kind of thrown out the window. It was, you know, all money is good money right now, is the way we kind of thought about it. And that would help the clients as well kind of navigate. Cause I remember, I'm also a broker in charge and had represented clients on a buy, and and for them, it was like their biggest purchase of their life. And we had literally
Mm-hmm.
closed in January 2020. And I think within, maybe a month, or maybe it was by the time they closed, it was literally like it hit and there was going to be no rentals for them to subsidize the place they just bought. Um, and that was scary for them. And so, it's that reassurance you have to bring to people that are super scared. I think it's akin to looking at, the stock market, or if, an RIA or financial advisor, that if you hold an asset long enough, or if you stick around long enough, most things, like I said, go up and to the right. And it's just navigating those bumps along the way.
I really like. Absolutely, absolutely. I like a saying from Stoicism, because Stoics used to think a lot about and meditate a lot about how to deal with crisis and whatnot. And it's a simple saying. It just says, "This too shall pass," right? And it's that reminder to take the macro view of things, like you were referring to, in terms of just remembering that, in the grand scheme of things, that the crisis we might be going through today, that is hard to see ahead from, will pass. At some point you will look back on it, and it will be just another one of those challenges that you will have overcome. So I like that mindset, Nathan. Now let's talk a little bit about something that's unique about what you do, and I want to understand where that comes from, which is you you reward your employees with more than just monetary compensation, which is something that, say, startups in the technology ecosystem have done, but it's not always something that you know businesses, small to mid-size businesses, let's say, in the property management space do. Where does that come from? Why is it important for you? uh, and of course, what has been the impact of you rewarding perhaps some employees with equity?
Yeah. Well, for those who don't know, this property management space, usually you work on a commission basis. You work out a commission with the client. You're not on a salary. They're paying you, X amount per, adjusted gross rental. And so of
Mhm.
that, I have made the decision to partition that to our employees. So they then receive X amount of that equity as their salary. And the reason I did that is because prior to starting this company, I worked in that space and was on a salary. And, I would go out and add a new property to our portfolio and, basically kind of get a congratulatory email. And that only reflected that basically I just gave myself more work. So
Mhm.
what I decided was the hospitality business too, it can have a high turnover rate. And so if you're just
Mhm.
adding and adding and adding property and property with no kind of reward, and you get the standard 3% or whatever it is, salary bump every year, I don't think your staff is going to feel as good about growth. So when we do add on properties, they have, part of the lion's share. And I think it gets them excited about, hey, this is new property. It's growing the brand, it's growing the business, but it's paying me more each time. And so incrementally, their salary grows based on the success of said property or the business itself. And I feel like that's provided itself with the least amount of turnover, the least amount of like brand equity where they are part owners of the company essentially. And I think that's the way it can be done. I know that that model might not work for all companies, because you are divvying out, a select commission, but for our company, it seemed to have worked wonders.
And so just to make sure I understand the mechanics and the audience can understand the mechanics as well. Is it equity as in you're giving them a piece of the company or a stock option that they can then decide to exercise, or is it more of a
No,
revenue
it would be,
share approach?
yeah, no, they're getting a percentage of a contract commission. So
Okay, okay.
call it, if we manage a property for 10%, they might be getting 1 or 2% of that 10%.
Hmm. And what have you seen, like what has the impact been in terms of the rotation? Like would you be able to say that you saw a before and an after? Because I'm sure maybe this is not something you implemented from day zero, right? Day one. Maybe this is something you implemented at some point and then you looked back and saw the impact in terms of employee retention and rotation and whatnot. What's been the impact there?
It actually has been since day one. Because
Oh yeah, okay.
I always thought that was the way, because you could adjust it too for, each year, just like, I think I read that, Bezos only owns 11% of Amazon, but obviously we know that how much 11% of Amazon is worth, or, Reed Hastings owns only 1.2% of Netflix still. So it can be, you know, chartered and course over growth. But I really think it lends itself, like I said, to you're not just giving this salary and benefits that incrementally grow while the upper echelon of the company grows in it. There's a delta that forms. And, I think with that becomes some rifts and kind of maybe, disdain for upper management if it gets too large. So I think when all the employees feel like, hey, every time this property books, I'm getting paid. And it makes the whole company's kind of move in one direction, um, and feel like, hey, I own part of this entire portfolio. Albeit a small slice, but
Hmm.
a slice.
No, I love that. I love that approach, and I think it definitely can have an impact on retention, employee satisfaction, reduced turnover, and as you said, it's the people aspect of this business is so crucial that it makes sense to find ways to kind of differentiate yourself with those type of comp plans. Now let's talk a little bit about what's been your approach to sort of growth and properties that you decide to add and not to add. I hear a lot of operators struggle sometimes with owners that maybe are difficult or don't provide the level of pricing flexibility that they require to be competitive. What have you learned about the way you approach growth, right? Is it something that has evolved? Have you always been as selective as you mentioned you are now, with your homeowners, or is it something that has been gradually built as you've gained reputation and experience?
I think it's, in the beginning, you got to take almost what you can get just to get your foot in the
Hmm.
door of the business. And then from there, you reach certain kind of milestones, whether that's financial or just, the sheer amount. Like right now, we're trying to be smart with what we take. It's, we're I've been asked if I'd want to manage property in different areas in the Charleston area. And to me, the answer as it stands is no, because, we're sitting on an island with 4,000 properties, about half are rentals. And so that's a large selection. And within that confine, I know not everyone, all your listeners can understand, where I'm at, the landscape, but there's certain pockets of oceanfront condos and homes, and it ranges anywhere from 1 bedroom to 10 bedroom houses, and they all present their different challenges, but we try and stay within complexes we're already at. So if we're approached to rent somewhere we're already at, it's pretty easy. Yes, it's good for housekeeping, it's good for boots on the ground, it makes sense on a quick turnaround day. Um, but there's a big difference between managing, a 1 bedroom condo, and, some of these homes can get up to 10,000 square feet. And that to me is almost like managing a boutique hotel. You have moving parts, whether that's the pool, the elevator, the landscaping. You can go on and on. So sometimes a 7 bedroom house isn't apples to apples of 7 1 bedroom condos. So you have to be kind of smart with, those portfolio homes. They photograph really well and they're beautiful to show off, but they come with a lot of work. So it's just it's being smart about what we take on. Box hotels are just very different from what we do, and every single home is, it's decorated different. It's has different, appliances that some have gas ranges, some have electric. There's just so many nuanced stuff to every single home you've ever been in, or I mean, that's what we're managing. It's just different types of homes. Even, you'd think these homes with elevators, every elevator functions differently, or some might have smart home tech that, differs from the other. So it's, you can't just sign on everything and growth at all costs, because then the quality is just really going to diminish from there. So we're just
Hmm.
trying, logistically stay in our lane, if you will. And I always consider any property, but we just trying to be smart with that, you know, slow growth attitude. We don't put a number or a metric. Hey, we need to add 10 more this year or 20 more this year. We kind of let them come to us. And, I'm usually out talking to those people that might have just purchased something here on Isle of Palms. And in those meetings, we get to know each other and each other's expectations. And that's really the foundation of where we make those decisions.
Yeah, no, and you're right about one of the challenges in this space is the fact that, yeah, standardization is way more challenging than with hotels, where you're just managing all units in one same location and all rooms are equal. What's been your approach to dealing with that from a logistical standpoint, from a hey, making sure that your staff knows what's different with each property, and at the same time, like you have scaled, right? It you are looking at 60 properties now, and each of them are going to be somewhat different to each other. What have you learned about how to manage that complexity that, even if you're selective with your homeowners, will inevitably come just from the business model of managing different vacation rental properties that are different from each other?
Yeah, it's familiarization and it's routine. We have people that are on the island every single day in the same units, arrival, departure. We use the same housekeepers per property. It never cycles out where it's a different staff that comes in. So they really familiarize themselves, and there's a pride factor there. I think with any of the staff of some of these homes, they oddly become like part of your conscious and your family, and you think about it. And you start to know them almost like your own home. And you might be in these homes more than the owner of the home is because they're an absentee homeowner by nature. So that pride factor kicks in. And it's really just, you really can't go a day or two without somebody being in these places over and over and over again. And, there's the stuff like checklists and everything we go through on the minutia side, but it's really just a repetitive routine of not being an absentee property manager. There's the kind of the old saying of you don't manage property from a desk. And so you really need to be in these places, in these units. Now I remind some of the clients sometimes, like if they come in, I always tell them, we never shower in the units. We don't sleep in the units. So there's going to be things they may notice when they come in that we didn't notice, just because we don't stay overnight in the units. We're checking everything surface level and even below. But I just want to remind the audience here is like anything, no one bats 1,000 in these industries. You're going to miss some things. It's just, it's really providing the best possible response if something were to go wrong, because it's just lends itself to you've got so many working parts to a home. Think about your own home that you live in. It's going to provide its own challenges, and those are going to come up in this industry more so than any, just because of heavy usage, et cetera. So response time, you can check everything day of, right before arrival, and you can get a call 3 hours later that the air conditioning just went out. And there's nothing you can do about
Mhm.
that at that time, except get on the phone, get that scheduled, get somebody out there, and get that thing fixed. But, to the question itself, it's really just repetition and knowing, every single thing in these properties and what they do and how and that only comes from experience of just repetition.
And I'm sure having people that stick around within your team, because of the incentives we mentioned earlier around giving them a piece of the pie and the revenue share and whatnot, that also helps, right? Because if there's repetition, but there's a lot of rotation, and every time you're having to start training all over again, then you all of a sudden have a challenge.
Yeah. Well, I
Yeah.
think
So. Mhm. Yeah. Go ahead.
oh, my apologies. I was saying, I think anyone who's kind of in this industry, they don't want to be behind a desk 8 to 5. I think they like to be out. I mean, obviously everywhere is different, but you're basically driving to an island on the East Coast, close to one of the top cities in America. And, you're out on property, you're in beautiful properties, and there's work involved, but it's not like, you're walking into a cold office building every day and you have a 1 hour lunch break and you get out at 5. It's a good life for somebody who wants to be physical, be in these units, and not confined to a more standardized approach to business.
Agreed. Nathan, what has been the evolution of where you spend your time as an owner in your business? Of course, at first you had to do everything, but I would assume with time you start to be a little bit more selective or strategic about where to spend time or not. So what's been that evolution, and where are you at now in terms of where you continue to see value for you as an owner to be spending your personal time, which is the most valuable resource of the company?
Yeah. Um, when I started out, it was the first property. I cleaned it too. I did everything because at that time, you do anything to kind of make it work and survived. And, fast forward to nowadays, I like to think of myself as like, you know, 25% involved in all facets, meaning, operations, overseeing the financials, 100% on the client side and that relationship, and growing kind of revenue and that sort of the, side of the business. But I still like getting my hands dirty, meaning I want to know what's happening with our guests. So I can see every message that comes in from our guests. I see the statements on what we're spending on maintenance. If I recognize, that, hey, is this the second charge at that property for kind of the same thing? What's going on there? I
Hmm.
you really need to kind of be able to dig into all facets. And 25% is just my thought pattern of like any good CEO's probably got to have his foot in the water of each segment of the business. Now where I spend
Hmm.
my time, like I said, I'm more kind of on the client relations side. Some call it owner relations. That I want my clients to come to the head of the company. I think they deserve that. We have a vested interest both ways. That's how we ultimately get paid. So I want them to, not go through, lower level staff before they can speak to me. So that's kind of, will that change or can that change? Sure. But as it stands, I'm very high in the client side and, um, the real estate side. And that's where I spend most of my time currently.
That is admirable as far as like how willing you are to get your hands dirty, like you said, to still be involved in the nitty gritty details that can make or break an operation, as well as the fact that 15 years in, 16 years in, you're still there, accessible for your owners. um, it does show a certain level of commitment to granularity, to quality, that I'm not sure everyone has, Nathan. So I think it's worth admiring, and worth mentioning that I think you're ahead of many in that sense. But I do want to tackle the component of like time management, because you do you know end up being pulled in many directions. And if you just let the day or the problems of the day or the requests of the team dictate where you're going to be spending that time, then you don't end up focusing that time on, for example, the owner relations, where you see the most value in terms of your time. So have you gotten more strict when it comes to how your team can kind of pull you in different directions, or do you still kind of let yourself go in one area of the company or another, depending on where you see fit on an ongoing basis that your time is needed?
Yeah. I think when you try and build culture, then people know what to ask you or when to go to you, or it doesn't need to rise to that level. I'm accessible to anybody on staff and especially any owner. But in this industry, time management, it's almost a farce. Like
Mhm.
there's no such thing in my opinion. Sometimes you never know what the day's going to bring. You can chart out your day and, there's sometimes this job comes with a lot of apologies to clients. I'm sorry this came up, but we had X happen at a property. It's something we would have done for your property. I think you can understand that took precedence right now, but here I am calling you at 8:30 p.m. when I'm, you know, done with that. it's just a kind of a different animal, this business. And I think as long as you're always kind of painting that picture, I think like anything, if you tell the truth about like what's happening, and you're not trying to say, oh, I was busy or, or whatever came up, it's like, hey, this happened on the island today. And, we were caught up in it. We had snow down here in Charleston, a week or 10 days ago for the first time in 7 years. We had to do tons of freeze prep, make sure pipes are dripping, because we're just not equipped for that in the South. And that's just like an anecdotal analog of, hey, I'm sorry I didn't get back to your email. We were making sure that your pipes didn't burst in your house. So,
Mm-hmm.
that's just kind of where you want to be, that have that level of transparency is why you might have taken a little bit longer to reply to something. So, um,
Mm-hmm.
and then it kind of lets your clients into the company too. And they feel more part of it, that, hey, did you know they were dealing with this down there, and that might be a dinner topic for them that night. So I think it's like that
Mm-hmm.
level of transparency with everyone of what our mission's trying to be. And as long as you can provide that, not, hide behind a shield of, a cloak of invisibility, then I think everybody gets that.
Interesting. How proactive um, or structured is your approach to owner relations versus, you know, if they have questions, if they have concerns, you're super accessible, but it's not like you're having, recurring touch points with them. Like, what's your because at the end of the day, you have 60 owners, and you are the one managing those relationships. You also have to split your time somehow. Is it like recurring meetings? Is it quarterly? Do you do a newsletter? Do you do webinars? Do you just like let them talk to you when they want to talk to you, but if they don't want to talk to you, don't proactively try to kind of bring things to their attention? What's your approach there?
Yeah, they all have my direct cell phone. Some I have, like I said, a text, relationship with. Some I have a phone relationship with. Some I have an email relationship. When they come in, sometimes I'll meet with them at the property. There's people that have been with us all 15 years. There's people that have been with us 30 days. And you kind of get to know them as a person, and obviously not a number, not a property. What are they in this for? What's their goals? And for the most part, they kind of tell you up front, this how they like to communicate. My thought is they have their own life too. They're running their own business. Some are doctors, some are lawyers. So their time management is different than mine. So, I think it's problematic for a company that's in the hospitality property management space to work on a traditional Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, because that's probably when they're working. Then nobody's getting in touch with anybody. So for the most part,
Mm-hmm.
I'm available. I talk to people sometimes, as late as 10, 11 p.m. Sometimes I talk to them 7 o'clock in the morning. I think for the most part, though, you just realize this is what you chose. This is the business you chose. And sometimes you got to take that phone call, on a Saturday, a Sunday, a Monday. It's kind of always, you know, the way it's going to be in this business. And then, there's also lulls, right? We have kind of a peak season here, or a 9 months. And then, sometimes it's slow here in the winter or whatever, and you can catch your breath. And because nobody's built to do it 24/7, 12 months a year. You are going to get that almost natural downtime in a seasonality business, and you try and
Mm-hmm.
make that time work, and then catch up in that regard. But yeah, it can be taxing. And I think there's obviously tools for that, though, right? Is it virtual assistants? Is it an assistant programming everything for you? Is it utilizing text to or tech to, hey, remember to get back to so and so by so and so? There's tools now you can use so you don't let too much fall through the cracks. But I'm human, people are human, some things happen, and you just don't want to beat yourself up too much when that happens, and just make a best effort to make it right if it does.
Wow. Wise Very wise words. Um,
Uh,
Nathan, when it comes to what you're saying here, about being human, it's okay to maybe make mistakes, or it's okay to also go all in during the time that it's busy, but also kind of like take take a breath, catch a breath when it's slower. What's your way, if I may go a little more personal, like what's your way of catching a breath? Because you seem to be so involved in the details of your business. Like, is there something that you have found for you allows you to, let's call it disconnect, let's call it like recharge your energies, or you just like the business so much that you don't find the need to have a way for you to disconnect there?
I mean, probably the latter. I really don't do it for the financial rewards. I generally like business. I've always been excited about it. In my off time, I'll consume podcasts like this one. I listen to a lot of business podcasts, but I've got a family, I've got a wife, I've got 3 kids under 10, and spending time with them is a great time to, a great downtime. I enjoy, um, sports like everyone else. I'll be watching the Super Bowl this Sunday. That's always a good time. There's little commonalities, I think, throughout at least the domestic, US, that I think bind us together. And those are, touch points, release points for a lot of people. And I enjoy all those. But for the most part, I like the relationships. I know, my clients, what their families are like, what teams they root for, et cetera. It's more than just like a client basis. I know them as a person. And if I know their college or their team just won a game, I'll send them a text and be like, hey, to keep it just a little lighter outside of the whole business side, that
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
relationships matter. So, I'm not into like meditation or anything like that. I don't do any of that. I'm interested in all of that, and I see the benefits of it. I just don't really practice any of it yet myself. But yeah, I think focusing on health and getting out and just kind of, it's not the end all be all. This is hospitality. We're not saving lives in an ER somewhere. You know, we're providing vacations for people. So take it serious, but not too seriously where it's a detriment to yourself.
No, that absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. And let's talk a little bit about, you've been in this space for so long, you've seen so many technologies and tools come in and out. Um, I'm curious to know, from when you look at your tech stack, right, and you look at all the tools you might be using, maybe some you have changed along the way, maybe some you've used all the time. What would you say is missing? Is there anything that you haven't found? Is there any tool, any solution, any software that if you could magically, decide to create it, that's what you would choose, and then you would find it at the next VRMA? What do you think is missing from a vendor perspective?
I think we're, the minutia of the business, right? So you get a lot of, repeat questions and just the mundane stuff is, where's, the local grocery store, for example, or whatever it is. You know, Chatbots have gotten a little better with that in the messaging apps of the, Airbnb, Verbo. We use Logify on the back end. Um, we're dabbling with Host AI, but that's early on. Just a way to quickly spit out the mundane, even though you can provide, everything up front in a confirmation letter and directory books and stuff, but people are always going to have questions, or they just overlooked it, or they forgot to check it on the way. And when they, that can really cut into kind of just communications when you're answering the same stuff over and over. So that's probably like part of the tech stack that hasn't been perfected yet, that especially in this industry where every single property is different and the recycling cans in a different spot, it's just such a nuanced approach that is there a tech out there that really is going to know every single thing? And there's some that are learning that, and it's just through hearing your responses that it learns it per property. but we're not fully there yet.
Absolutely. And when you look ahead for you as a business, and when you look also more macro in terms of the industry, what are the things that you're excited about? What are the things that you're cautious about? So um, let's start with the caution part. Like what's something that when you look ahead, you are trying to perhaps hedge in terms of risks, or start to prepare for in advance, or yeah, just be a little bit like on the cautious side. Let's start there.
I would say, the expectation size of your client, especially new clients, in the fact that, look, from 2020 to 2024, we're up 39% in real estate prices. That changes your cap rate. So we can bring in as much money as we can bring in, and rates have gone up, and all that is great. But, property used to cost less not too long ago. And you could, meaning the cap rate's going to change. And so, I see that as an ongoing struggle where, you just can't go through the roof on rates forever. And there's going to be a certain plateau that people are willing to pay. We know airline travel has gotten expensive. At some point, there's kind of a breaking point of who can afford what, and you need to find that sweet spot. But, you can't expect to keep buying property at, inflated rates and expecting it to really do well on the rental side. Now, it might mitigate mortgage, it might mitigate property tax, it might mitigate insurance costs. But the days of somebody who bought something in, the early 2000s, or even, the 2010s, and it's fully green as a rental, that might not be the goal anymore. The goal is maybe, you're mitigating on one side, but the equity is growing on the other, and that delta grows over a longer period of time. But the cap rate's probably going to shrink for how expensive, housing's gotten. And I think that boom of 21, a lot of people were buying Airbnbs or Verbos, in the lexicon, it's Airbnbs, but to us, it's STRs or vacation rentals. And, do those people, still stay afloat all these years later? It's not easy to just get great guests every year, and more competition enters. So you just wonder if there will be kind of a fallout a little bit from that time period if people were truly just buying up STRs all over this country. We're a little more probably resilient to that, but you do read things in other areas where that could be problematic in the industry for those types. We feel good about 2025 this year in the short term, but those are things I think about as macro headwinds. And then things I'm excited about,
Yeah, so
almost go ahead.
no. I was just gonna say that setting the right expectations, right, is kind of like what I heard there, so that homeowners don't think that the kind of numbers that they might have heard of in the past are the same numbers that they can necessarily expect, and that like, hey, if all you're looking for is someone that can give you an inflated projection of revenue that can be generated, like go elsewhere. You're not here to sell a dream that's unattainable. You're here to achieve what's achievable, and always better to under promise and over deliver than the other way around.
Absolutely.
And then on the exciting side, on the things that you're looking forward to, opportunities you're trying to capitalize on. You mentioned change is constant, so change also brings opportunities. What's the main opportunity you see for 2025?
I'm excited about some of the tech we discussed. I think there's a lot of good players out there in this space. It's kind of spawned its own industry, a sub industry of vacation rental tech, and that's exciting. I think I also do get excited when if there was a 2021 or 2020 bubble, and sometimes those bursts, it lets the best people rise to the top. So there's opportunity there for us to keep growing and navigating, and and just that slow growth outlook of doing it right. That excites me. And then just, the vacation rental space in general. It probably got its most, spotlight in 2020, 21, and it introduced a whole number of new demographics to it. I'm excited to see, when I see Verbo commercials or Airbnb commercials in big spots on Super Bowl, I think that's great that those companies have achieved that level. You know, that's within the last really 5 to 10 years, if that. That is now part of like the national landscape that you see that level for this industry, in prime time viewing, and I think that's exciting.
Mhm. Yeah, no, it definitely is. Well, listen, Nathan, this has been great. This has been very insightful. Lots of fun. I could keep you here for 2 more hours, but we'll have to cut it somewhere. I appreciate you taking the time, and thank you so much for sharing all these insights. It has been very very helpful.
Sebastian, it's been a pleasure. Appreciate it.
Likewise. Talk soon.